Dawn broke over the small town of Millbrook as Michelle Johnson rushed to get her son ready for school. The morning sun streamed through the worn curtains of their modest apartment, highlighting the coffee stains on her nurse's uniform. At 35, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had faced life's hardships head-on. "Marcus, baby, you're gonna be late," she called out, stuffing a peanut butter sandwich into a brown paper bag. Her 10-year-old son emerged from his room, dragging his backpack behind him. "Mom, why can't I stay home today? I could help you with the garden," Marcus pleaded, his big brown eyes looking up at her hopefully. Michelle smiled, touching his cheek gently. The community garden had become their weekend sanctuary, a small plot of land where they grew vegetables to help stretch their grocery budget. "Nice try, young man. But education comes first. That's what your grandma always said." The mention of grandma made them both pause. It had been just 6 months since they lost her to cancer, leaving Michelle to raise Marcus alone. The medical bills had forced them to sell their family home and move into this small apartment on the other side of town. "Miss Johnson," a voice called from outside. It was Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor. "Your car's making that funny noise again." Michelle's heart sank as she stepped outside to look at her old Honda. The engine sputtered and coughed, black smoke rising from under the hood. This was the last thing she needed. Her shift at the hospital started in 30 minutes. "I'll call Uncle Ray," Marcus suggested, referring to their neighbor who sometimes helped with car troubles. "No time," Michelle said, grabbing her son's hand. "We're going to have to walk you to school and I'll catch the bus to work." As they hurried down the street, Michelle's mind raced with calculations. A car repair would eat into their savings, and rent was due next week. She had picked up extra shifts at the hospital, but it never seemed enough. They passed by Wilson's farm supply store where a crowd had gathered. The old man Wilson had finally sold his business, and apparently the new owner was in town. Michelle barely glanced at the commotion. She had more pressing matters on her mind. "Mom, look!" Marcus pointed at a man stepping out of a dusty pickup truck. He was tall, with dark skin weathered by the sun, wearing worn jeans and a simple work shirt. Despite his humble appearance, he carried himself with quiet confidence. The man caught Michelle's eye and tipped his hat. "Morning," he said with a warm smile that made her pause for a moment. "Looks like you're in a hurry. Need a ride?" Michelle's first instinct was to decline. She'd taught Marcus never to accept rides from strangers. But there was something about this man's eyes, kind and honest, that made her hesitate. "I'm James Carter, the new owner," he introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "Just moved in from Georgia to take over Wilson's place." "Michelle Johnson," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. "And this is my son, Marcus. We're actually running late." "Say no more," James said, opening the passenger door of his truck. "Where to?" Against her better judgment, Michelle accepted the ride. As they drove through town, James told them about his plans to turn Wilson's store into a proper farming supply center. Maybe even start a program to teach kids about agriculture. Marcus's eyes lit up. "Like growing vegetables? Mom and I have a garden. Is that right?" James glanced at Michelle with interest. "You know your way around plants, Miss Johnson." "It's just a small community plot," she said modestly. "Helps with the groceries." They reached Marcus's school just as the first bell rang. As her son jumped out of the truck, James turned to Michelle. "The hospital's on my way. Let me drop you off too." During the short drive, Michelle found herself sharing more than she intended, about her work as a nurse, about losing her mother, about her struggles as a single parent. There was something about James that made talking easy. "Sounds like you could use a break," he said as they pulled up to the hospital. "Why don't you and Marcus come by the store this weekend? I could use some advice about setting up that community program, and I make a mean sweet tea." Michelle hesitated. "I don't know. Just as neighbors." James assured her with that same warm smile. "Besides, I've got a greenhouse full of tomato plants that need good homes." As she watched him drive away, Michelle felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a flutter of possibility, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had a son to raise, bills to pay, and no time for distractions. Little did she know that James Carter was watching her in his rearview mirror. his kind smile fading into something more calculated. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice losing its gentle southern drawl. "I'm in. Found the perfect cover." He paused, listening. "Trust me, no one's going to suspect a thing. A farming supply store in a small town? It's perfect for moving product. And I might have found something else interesting, too." He ended the call and stared at the hospital entrance where Michelle had disappeared. For a moment, something like regret crossed his face. Then he hardened his expression and drove away, leaving behind a trail of dust and the first threads of a web that would soon entangle them all. In the hospital, Michelle went about her duties, her mind occasionally drifting to James's smile. It had been so long since anyone had shown such simple kindness. Maybe a visit to the store wouldn't hurt. After all, they did need supplies for their garden, but life had taught Michelle Johnson to be careful, to protect herself and Marcus from disappointment. She'd been down this road before, trusting too easily, believing in promises that turned to dust. This time would be different. This time she would keep her guard up. As she tended to her patients, she couldn't know that fate had already set, its wheels in motion. In a town as small as Millbrook, secrets had a way of surfacing, and the truth about James Carter would shake their world to its foundation. The morning shift stretched on, filled with the usual parade of ailments and worried faces. Michelle moved from room to room, dispensing medicine and comfort in equal measure. Her colleagues often marveled at her ability to stay composed, to carry her own burdens while lifting those of others. "You're an angel, Miss Johnson," said old Mr. Peterson as she changed his bandages. "Don't know how you do it all by yourself." Michelle just smiled, the way she always did when people commented on her situation. She had learned long ago that strength wasn't about handling everything alone. It was about keeping going, even when you didn't know how you would make it through another day. Outside the hospital windows, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. But bigger storms were brewing, ones that would test everything Michelle thought she knew about trust, love, and survival. James Carter's arrival in Millbrook wasn't just the beginning of a love story. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would change lives forever. Saturday morning came with the promise of sunshine. Michelle stood in front of her mirror, fussing with her hair more than usual. She told herself it was just a casual visit to get gardening supplies, nothing more. "Mom, are you ready?" Marcus called out, already by the door. His excitement about visiting the farm supply store had been building all week. They walked the few blocks to Wilson's, now Carter's, store, and Michelle's heart skipped when she saw the transformation. The old dusty windows were clean, fresh paint brightened the facade, and a hand-painted sign announced Carter's Farm and Garden Supply. James stepped out to greet them, looking even more handsome in the morning light. "Welcome to my humble establishment," he said, leading them inside. The interior had been completely reorganized, with neat rows of supplies and a new section dedicated to organic gardening. "This is amazing," Michelle admitted, running her hand along a shelf of seed packets. "Wait till you see the greenhouse," James said, his hand ghosting over the small of her back as he guided them through the store. Behind the main building, a large greenhouse gleamed in the sun. Inside, rows of healthy plants stretched toward the ceiling. The air was warm and humid, filled with the smell of earth and growing things. "Marcus, why don't you check out those tomato plants while I talk business with your mom?" James suggested, pointing to a section of potted vegetables. Once Marcus was occupied, James turned to Michelle. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said softly, "about the garden helping with groceries. What if we could expand that idea?" Michelle looked at him questioningly. "I want to start a community farming program," he explained. "Teaching people to grow their own food, maybe even selling the excess at a farmer's market. I could use someone who knows the community, someone with experience." "Are you offering me a job?" Michelle asked, surprised. "Part-time, weekends only," James said quickly. "I know you've got your nursing, but the pay would be good and you'd have access to all the supplies you need for your own garden." It sounded too good to be true. But when Michelle looked into James's eyes, she saw only sincerity, or at least what she wanted to believe was sincerity. What she couldn't see was the man watching them through the greenhouse windows, taking Pictures with a long-lens camera, or the encrypted messages being sent to a burner phone. Carter's making contact with the nurse, proceeding as planned. Back inside, Marcus had gathered an armful of plants. "Mom, can we get these? Mr. Carter says they're perfect for our plot." James laughed. "Tell you what, consider them a welcome gift, along with some proper fertilizer and tools." "We can't accept all that," Michelle protested. "Please," James said, touching her arm gently. "Let me do this. Consider it an investment in my future gardening consultant." The way he looked at her made Michelle's defenses waver. It had been so long since anyone had shown such interest, such care. They left the store with arms full of supplies and hearts full of possibility. James insisted on driving them to the community garden to help plant their new acquisitions. As they worked the soil together, Michelle found herself opening up more. She told him about Marcus's father, who disappeared before their son was born, about her dreams of going back to school for her RN degree, about the weight of being everything for everyone while having no one to lean on herself. James listened, offered advice, made them laugh. By the time the sun began to set, it felt like they'd known each other for years instead of days. "You know," James said as they packed up the tools, "there's an old saying in Georgia, sometimes the best things grow in unexpected places." He was looking at her when he said it, and Michelle felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. But across town, in a dimly lit motel room, a different scene was unfolding. The man with the camera downloaded his photos onto a laptop. On the screen, images of James, Michelle, and Marcus flashed by. A voice crackled through a secure phone line. "Is he maintaining his cover?" "Too well," the man replied. "He's getting close to a local woman and her kid." "Perfect," the voice said. "The closer he gets, the less anyone will suspect. Make sure he remembers what's at stake." The man closed the laptop, his expression grim. He knew James Carter's real story, knew what happened to people who got too close to his operation. But orders were orders. Back at her apartment, Michelle tucked Marcus into bed. He was still chattering about James and the garden and all their plans. "Mom," he said sleepily, "is Mr. Carter going to be around a lot?" "Now?" Michelle smoothed his hair back. "Would that be okay with you?" Marcus nodded. "He's nice and he makes you smile." Those simple words hit Michelle hard. Had she really been smiling more? Had her loneliness been so visible that even her 10-year-old could see it? She stayed up late that night, sitting by her window, thinking about James Carter, about his gentle hands and kind eyes, about the way he listened, really listened when she talked. But she also thought about her responsibilities, about the promises she'd made to herself after Marcus's father left, about the careful walls she'd built to protect her heart. In the darkness of his farmhouse, James sat at his kitchen table staring at his own phone. Messages from his handlers blinked on the screen, reminding him of deadlines, of quotas, of consequences. He thought about Michelle's smile, about Marcus's innocent enthusiasm. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed world felt like it was splitting at the seams. A sudden knock at his door made him jump. He quickly deleted the messages and grabbed the gun he kept hidden under the table. But it was just his associate, the man with the camera. "Getting awful cozy with that nurse," the man said without preamble. James's face hardened. "I'm maintaining my cover. Just remember why you're here. One wrong move and everything falls apart. And we both know what happens then." After the man left, James stood in his dark kitchen for a long time. The weight of his secrets felt heavier than ever. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Michelle's face, trust shining in her eyes. He had a choice to make. But in his line of work, choices usually came with deadly consequences. The summer days slipped by like honey dripping from a jar. Michelle found herself spending more and more time at Carter's farm supply, helping James set up the community program. What started as weekend consulting quickly turned into regular evening visits, with Marcus doing his homework at the store's front counter while they worked. James proved to be more than just a charming face. He showed genuine interest in helping the community, offering discounted supplies to low-income families and teaching basic farming skills to anyone willing to learn. The store became a gathering place, filled with the buzz of conversation and the smell of fresh earth. but darkness lurked beneath the surface. Late one night, after Michelle and Marcus had gone home, James met with his real business partners in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place smelled of diesel fuel and danger. "You're falling behind schedule," said Victor, a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes. "The boss isn't happy." James wiped sweat from his forehead. "The store's perfect cover. Nobody suspects a thing. We've already moved 3 shipments through the fertilizer deliveries." "That's not enough," Victor growled. "And this thing with the nurse, it's a liability." "Michelle has nothing to do with this," James said sharply. Victor stepped closer, his breath hot on James's face. "Everything has to do with this. You're getting soft, Carter. Don't forget who owns you." The threat hung in the air like smoke. James thought about the path that had led him here. The gambling debts, the desperate choices, the gradual slide into a world he couldn't escape. Now, when he finally had something real to hold on to, it threatened to slip through his fingers. The next morning, Michelle noticed something different about James. Dark circles under his eyes, tension in his shoulders. "Everything okay?" she asked, touching his arm. He pulled away slightly. "Just business stress," but Michelle wasn't easily fooled. Years of nursing had taught her to read people's pain, both physical and emotional. "You know you can talk to me, right?" James looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment considered telling her everything. Instead, he kissed her, for the first time. It wasn't planned or perfect. It happened between bags of fertilizer and shelves of garden tools, but it felt like coming home. Michelle melted into the kiss, her heart racing. When they pulled apart, she saw her own longing, reflected in his eyes. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," James whispered. "What took you so long?" she asked, smiling. That evening, they had their first real date. James closed the store early and cooked dinner in his farmhouse kitchen. Michelle wore a dress she hadn't had occasion to wear in years, and they talked for hours over homemade chicken and dumplings. "Tell me something true," Michelle said, as they sat on his porch swing, watching the stars come out. James's heart clenched. "I'm falling for you," he said. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Meanwhile, Marcus was at home with Mrs. Patterson, working on a science project about plant growth. He'd been using the vegetables from their garden, carefully documenting their progress. "Mr. Carter sure knows a lot about plants," Mrs. Patterson commented. "He's been good for your mama, too," Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Mum smiles all the time now, and Mr. Carter's teaching me about composting." But not everyone in town shared their enthusiasm. Sheriff Davis had been watching Carter's farm supply with growing suspicion. The sudden increase in fertilizer deliveries, the late-night activity, the out-of-state vehicles. Something didn't add up, I'm telling you. There's more going on there than tomato plants, he told his deputy. "Run a background check on James Carter. Dig deep." The deputy nodded, not knowing that every database inquiry would trigger alerts in carefully placed surveillance systems. The net was tightening, and James was running out of time. That night, after their date, James walked Michelle to her door. Their goodbye kiss was longer, deeper, full of promise. But as he drove home, his phone buzzed with a message that made his blood run cold. Sheriff's asking questions. "Clean house or we clean it for you?" James sat in his truck for a long time, engine idling in his driveway. He thought about Michelle's trust, about Marcus's innocent admiration. He thought about the life he could have had if he'd made different choices. Inside his house, the burner phone kept buzzing. Victor's warnings echoed in his head. The walls of his carefully constructed lie were starting to crumble. He had to make a decision. But every choice seemed impossible. Tell Michelle the truth and risk losing her, or worse, putting her in danger. Keep lying and watch as his past inevitably caught up with them all. Run away and leave behind the only real happiness he'd known in years. The next morning, Michelle noticed more strange cars driving past the store. Men she didn't recognize came in asking odd questions about fertilizer orders. James seemed distracted, jumpy. "Something's wrong," she said finally, cornering him in the greenhouse. "Talk to me." James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Victor walked in, his scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. "Well, well," Victor said. "Isn't this cozy?" Michelle felt James tense beside her. The temperature in the greenhouse seemed to drop despite the summer heat. "James?" she questioned, looking between the two men. "What's going on?" But before anyone could answer, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. James's face went pale. Victor's hand moved to his jacket pocket, and in that moment, surrounded by blooming plants and festering secrets, everything began to unravel. The police sirens grew louder. Michelle's heart pounded as she looked at James, searching his face for answers. Victor pulled out a gun, making her gasp. "Inside," Victor ordered, pushing them into the store's back room. "Both of you." James stepped in front of Michelle protectively. "This is between us, Victor. Let her go." "Too late for that," Victor sneered. "She's seen too much." The back room was dark and cramped, filled with boxes and farm equipment. Victor forced them to sit on wooden crates while he paced, gun trained on them. "I told you she was a liability," he spat at James. "Now look what you've done." Michelle's mind raced. The strange deliveries, the late-night meetings, James's nervous behavior, it all started making terrible sense. "What's really going on here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. James couldn't meet her eyes. "The store, it's not just for farming supplies. We've been moving drugs through the fertilizer shipments." The truth hit Michelle like a physical blow. She thought about all the times she'd defended James to her suspicious neighbors, how she'd let him get close to Marcus. "How could you?" she whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," James said desperately. "I got in debt, they offered a way out. But then I met you and Marcus." "Shut up," Victor snapped. "The cops are here because of your sloppiness. Now we clean up, and that means no witnesses." Outside, they could hear Sheriff Davis calling through a megaphone. "This is the police. We have the building surrounded." Victor grabbed Michelle roughly. "Hire our ticket out. A hostage should keep them back." "No!" James lunged forward, tackling Victor. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small space. Michelle screamed as both men crashed into a shelf, sending farm tools clattering to the floor. They struggled for the weapon, trading punches. She looked around frantically for something to help. Her eyes landed on a heavy wrench. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung, hitting Victor in the back of the head. He crumpled to the ground. James staggered to his feet, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Michelle, I'm so sorry. I never wanted—" "Save it," she cut him off, backing away. "I trusted you. I let you near my son." Tears streamed down her face as she ran for the door. James didn't try to stop her. She burst out of the store with her hands up. "Don't shoot! I'm a hostage!" Police swarmed the building. Sheriff Davis himself helped Michelle to safety while his deputies rushed inside. They found James, kneeling beside Victor's unconscious body, hands raised in surrender. The next few hours passed in a blur. Michelle sat in an ambulance, answering questions while paramedics checked her for injuries. She learned the truth about James Carter, or whatever his real name was. He'd been a successful farmer once, but gambling debts had made him vulnerable to Victor's organization. They'd forced him to use his legitimate business as a front for their drug operation. When he'd moved to Millbrook, it was supposed to be just another job. "I fell in love with you," James told her, as deputies led him to a police car. That part was real. Michelle turned away, unable to watch as they drove him off. Mrs. Patterson brought Marcus to the hospital where Michelle was being checked out. He ran into her arms, crying. "I saw it on TV," he sobbed. "They said Mr. Carter is a bad man." Michelle held her son tight, her own tears falling. "Sometimes people aren't who we think they are, baby, but we're going to be okay." That night, she couldn't sleep. The community garden she'd loved so much now felt tainted. The store where she'd spent so many happy hours was a crime scene. But as she watched Marcus sleeping peacefully, Michelle felt her strength returning. They'd survived before, they would survive again. The next morning, she went to work at the hospital like always. Her patients needed her and routine was comforting. "You're stronger than you know," old Mr. Peterson told her as she changed his bandages. "My late wife used to say that God never gives us more than we can handle." Michelle managed a small smile. "Your wife was a wise woman." Weeks passed. The story made headlines, then faded. Carter's farm supply was closed, the building dark and empty. Michelle drove past it every day, each time feeling the ache in her chest lessen slightly. She threw herself into her work and caring for Marcus. They started a new garden plot on the other side of town. Life went on. Then one day a letter arrived from the county jail. Michelle recognized James's handwriting on the envelope. She sat holding it for a long time, wondering if she should open. It finally she did. Inside was a deed to the store and all its equipment, signed over to her name. A note read, "I know I can never make things right, but maybe you can turn this into something good. The community garden program was real. Your dreams for it were real, and so was my love for you." Michelle stared at the papers, tears blurring her vision. The betrayal still hurt, but something else stirred in her heart. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. That evening she took Marcus to their new garden plot. As they worked the soil together, she thought about James's words. "Maybe we can't always trust people," she told Marcus, "but we can trust ourselves, and we can keep growing, keep trying to make something good." Marcus nodded wisely. "Like our tomatoes?" Michelle laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. "Yes, baby, just like our tomatoes." She looked at the setting sun, thinking about choices and consequences, about love and betrayal, about the way life could surprise you with both pain and possibility. The store still stood empty on Main Street, waiting. Michelle wasn't sure what she would do with it yet. But she knew that sometimes the best things could grow from the hardest seasons, if you were brave enough to plant new seeds. 3 months passed. Autumn painted the trees golden, and Michelle threw herself into her work at the hospital. The deed to Carter's farm supply sat untouched in her dresser drawer. Every time she drove past the empty building, memories flooded back, both sweet and bitter. One rainy Tuesday, Michelle was checking on patients when Sheriff Davis appeared at the hospital. "Miss Johnson, we need to talk," he said gravely. "It's about James Carter." Michelle's heart skipped. "What about him?" "He's agreed to testify against Victor's organization. But there's a problem. Victor's people have made threats. We need to put James in witness protection." Michelle gripped her clipboard tighter. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're in danger too. They know about you and Marcus. We think it's best if you leave town for a while." The words hit her like a truck. Leave Millbrook? Leave their home, Marcus's school, her job? "I can't just uproot my son's life," she protested. "You might not have a choice," the sheriff said softly. "Victor's got connections, even in prison. Last night someone broke into your apartment." Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. "Mrs. Patterson had Marcus today after school." "I need to get my son," she said, already moving. "I've got deputies watching him. He's safe. But you need to make a decision quickly." That evening, Michelle sat Marcus down in their small living room. "How do you explain to a 10-year-old that your life isn't safe anymore?" "Baby, we need to take a little trip," she started. "Because of the bad men?" Marcus asked, surprising her. "I heard Mrs. Patterson talking on the phone." Michelle pulled him close. "Yes, baby. Just for a little while, until things are safe again." "Will we see Mr. Carter?" The question hung in the air. Michelle closed her eyes, remembering James's face the last time she saw him. Despite everything, her heart still ached. "No, sweetie. Where we're going, we'll have new names. A new start." The next few days were a blur of packing, paperwork, and tearful goodbyes. The U.S. Marshals helped them pick essential items. Everything else would have to be left behind. The night before they left, Michelle stood in Carter's farm supply one last time. The shelves were dusty, but she could still smell the earth and growing things. A noise made her spin around. James stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 marshals. "They said I could say goodbye," he said quietly. Michelle wanted to be angry, wanted to blame him for destroying their lives. Instead, she felt tears rolling down her cheeks. "I never meant for any of this to happen," James said, stepping closer. "I was going to tell you everything, find a way out. But you didn't," Michelle whispered. "Now my son has to leave his home." "I know. That's why I made a deal. My testimony for your protection." He reached for her hand. "Michelle, She pulled away. "Don't, please, just tell me one thing. Was any of it real?" "All of it," James said, his voice breaking. "Every moment with you and Marcus. That's why I'm doing this. You deserve a chance at a real life, even if I can't be part of it. A marshal touched James's shoulder. Time to go. The store is still yours, James said quickly. When this is over, when it's safe, maybe you can make it. Something good. Michelle watched him leave, feeling like her heart was being torn in two. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The next morning, before dawn, Michelle and Marcus climbed into a black SUV. Their new identities waited in a manila envelope. Their new life would begin in a city thousands of miles away. As they drove past the town limits, Marcus pressed his face against the window. Mum, will we ever come back? Michelle squeezed his hand. Someday, baby, when it's safe. She thought about James, heading to his own new life somewhere else. About the store, standing empty but full of possibilities. About the seeds of love and trust that had grown in that greenhouse, even if they'd been planted in poisoned soil. The sun rose over Millbrook one last time as they drove away. Michelle Johnson and her son disappeared into the witness protection program, leaving behind everything they'd known. But life had taught Michelle that endings weren't always endings. Sometimes they were just the soil where new beginnings took root. Miles away in a different car heading in a different direction, James Carter watched the same sunrise. He held a small photo of Michelle and Marcus in the garden, their faces bright with laughter. Soon he would have to surrender it, along with every other trace of his old life. The marshals had told him he could never contact them again. It was the price of keeping them safe. But as he memorized their faces one last time, James made a silent promise. Someday, when Victor's organization was destroyed, when the danger had passed, he would find a way to make things right. For now, 3 separate cars carried 3 separate hearts away from Millbrook, each holding pieces of a broken dream. But like the seeds in Michelle's garden, sometimes broken things had a way of growing into something new. The store stood empty on Main Street waiting. Its windows reflected the morning light like promises waiting to be kept. And somewhere, in the community garden, the last tomatoes of summer ripened on their vines, proof that life went on season after season. No matter what storms had passed, 2 years passed. Michelle and Marcus settled into their new life in Seattle under the names Sarah and Tyler Wilson. Their apartment overlooked the ocean, and Marcus had grown into a lanky 12-year-old who joined the school gardening club. Michelle worked nights at Seattle General Hospital, trying to keep busy enough to forget. But sometimes, when the fog rolled in from the bay, she'd catch herself thinking about warm southern days and the smell of fresh earth at Carter's farm supply. One rainy morning, Sheriff Davis called on a secure line. "The trial's starting," he said. "James is testifying next week." Michelle sat down hard on her couch. "Is it safe?" "Victor's organization is falling apart. His own people are turning on him. But..." The sheriff paused. "We've had reports of his men in Seattle." Michelle's blood ran cold. "How? Nobody knows where we are." "There might be a leak in the marshal's office. We're investigating, but until then, you need to move again." That night, Michelle watched Marcus sleep, tears rolling down her face. Just when they'd started to feel settled, just when the nightmares had begun to fade, they had to run again. But fate had other plans. The next morning, as they packed their essentials, Michelle's burner phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Michelle?" A familiar voice made her heart stop. "It's James." "How did you—" "No time," he cut her off. "Victor's men found me. The marshal assigned to me was dirty. They're coming for you too. The sheriff just told me—" "Listen carefully," James said urgently. "They're watching the airports and bus stations, but I have a plan. Remember the greenhouse? The hidden storage room under the floorboards?" "Where you kept the drugs," Michelle said bitterly. "Yes, but it's not just a room, it's part of an old underground railroad network. There are tunnels, safe houses. I've got people I trust, people who owe me favors. They can help you disappear for real this time." Michelle looked at their half-packed bags. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I love you," James said simply, "and because I'd die before I let them hurt you or Marcus." Before she could respond, she heard shouting through the phone, then gunshots. "James, get to Millbrook," he gasped. "The greenhouse. 3 days. I'll..." The line went dead. Michelle stood frozen, the phone falling from her hand. Then training kicked in, both as a nurse and as a woman who'd learned to survive. She shook Marcus awake. "Baby, we've got to go, now." They slipped out the back door just as black SUVs pulled up in front of their building. Michelle caught a glimpse of men in dark suits running up the stairs. What followed was a desperate race across the country. They took back roads, switched cars, used cash only. Michelle taught Marcus to watch for tails, to memorize emergency meeting points, to trust no one. 3 days later, they pulled into Millbrook under cover of darkness. The town hadn't changed much. Carter's farm supply stood like a ghost in the shew moonlight. They crept through the overgrown garden to the greenhouse. The glass was dirty but unbroken. Inside, everything was covered in dust. "Mom," Marcus whispered, "someone's been here." Fresh footprints marked the dusty floor. Michelle's heart raced as she felt for the hidden latch James had described. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase. Flashlight beams danced below. "You're late," a familiar voice called up. James stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face older, harder, but his eyes still kind. Behind him, a tunnel stretched into darkness. "You made it," Michelle breathed. "Barely." He showed them the bullet graze on his arm. "But I had to get here. Had to make sure you were safe." Marcus ran down the stairs and hugged him. After a moment's hesitation, Michelle followed. "I've got a safe house ready," James said, holding them both, "and evidence that will put Victor away for good. After that..." He looked at Michelle questioningly. She touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble. "After that, we'll see." Suddenly, voices echoed from above. Flashlight beams swept the greenhouse. "They followed us," Michelle realized with horror. "No," James said grimly. "They followed me, but I'm done running." He pulled out a small recorder. "Everything Victor's ever done is on here, his whole operation. So I've got copies hidden all over the country, set to release to the FBI if anything happens to me." "James, take the tunnel," he ordered, pressing the recorder into her hand. "It comes out at the old church. Sheriff Davis is waiting." "You're coming with us," Marcus insisted. James knelt down to the boy's level. "I've got to make sure they don't follow. I've got to make things right." Michelle knew that look in his eyes. "We just found you again. And you'll find me again," he promised. "When it's over. When it's safe." He kissed her quickly, fiercely. "I love you. Both of you. Now go." They ran down the tunnel as footsteps thundered above. The last thing they heard was James's voice, strong and clear. "Looking for me, boys?" Then gunshots, then silence. Sheriff Davis met them at the old church with a team of FBI agents. Michelle handed over James's recorder with shaking hands while Marcus clung to her side. "We've got a SWAT team heading to the greenhouse," the sheriff said. "But first we need to get you somewhere safe." Michelle stared back at the dark tunnel entrance. "James is back there, and he can handle himself," Davis assured her. "That man's got 9 lives." They spent the night in a safe house outside town. Michelle didn't sleep, jumping at every sound. Marcus finally dozed off around dawn, exhausted from their journey. The morning news reported a shootout at Carter's farm supply. 3 of Victor's men were dead, 2 more were in custody, but there was no sign of James. Days turned into weeks. The FBI used James's evidence to dismantle Victor's entire operation. Arrests were made across the country. Victor himself faced multiple life sentences, but still no word from James. Michelle and Marcus stayed in protective custody, moving between safe houses. She took leave from her nursing job, and Marcus did his schoolwork remotely. One morning, an FBI agent brought her a newspaper. The headline read, "Drug Kingdom Falls, Victor Petrov and associates found guilty." "It's over," the agent said. "You can go home now." But where was home? Their apartment in Seattle belonged to different people. Their old life in Millbrook felt like a distant dream. Then came another secure call from Sheriff Davis. "We found him," he said without preamble. Michelle's heart stopped. "Is he alive?" "Barely. He's at County General." The drive to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of Michelle's life. Marcus held her hand tight as they walked through familiar corridors. James lay in a hospital bed, bandaged and bruised, but breathing. His eyes opened when they entered. "Told you I'd make it right," he whispered. Michelle broke down crying. Marcus hugged him carefully, mindful of the tubes and wires. "What happened?" Michelle asked when she could speak again. "Victor's men shot me, but I made it to the tunnel. Different branch than yours. Crawled for miles. Some old farmers found me in their barn 3 days later. Why didn't you contact us sooner? Had to be sure it was safe, had to know Victor's whole organization was gone." He squeezed her hand. "No more running, no more lies." The next few months brought healing, not just for James's wounds, but for their broken trust. Michelle took a job at County General to be near him during recovery. Marcus visited after school, bringing books and garden updates. The FBI cleared James of major charges in exchange for his cooperation. He'd still serve some time, but with good behavior, he'd be out in a year. "I'll wait," Michelle told him during a hospital visit. "We'll wait." James shook his head. "You've waited long enough. You should—" She silenced him with a kiss. "My choice this time." 1 year later, James walked out of prison into bright sunshine. Michelle and Marcus stood waiting. They drove straight to Carter's farm supply. The old store had been transformed. New paint, clean windows, fresh flowers in boxes. The sign now read Johnson & Carter Community Gardens. "While you were away," Michelle explained, "I used the deed you gave me. Made something good, like you said." Inside, the store bustled with activity. Local families bought supplies at discounted prices. Children learned about planting in the teaching garden out back. The greenhouse bloomed with new life. "The hidden room?" James asked quietly. "Sealed up, but we kept the tunnel entrance. Historical Society wants to preserve it. Different kind of underground operation now." James laughed, then grew serious. "I don't deserve this second chance." "Maybe not," Michelle agreed. "But love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing, and I choose to believe in new beginnings." Marcus came running up. "Mr. Carter, want to see our new tomato plants?" James looked at Michelle, who nodded with tears in her eyes. "Lead the way, buddy," he said, taking the boy's hand. Together they walked into the greenhouse, where sunshine streamed through clean glass and new seeds waited to grow in honest soil. The past couldn't be erased, but the future stretched before them like fresh-turned earth, ready for whatever they chose to plant there. 6 months later, Johnson & Carter Community Gardens had become the heart of Millbrook. Michelle ran the business side while James handled the farming. Marcus spent every afternoon after school helping customers and tending plants. But peace never lasts forever. One quiet Sunday morning, a sleek black car pulled up outside the store. A woman in expensive clothes stepped out, her high heels clicking. On the sidewalk, "I'm looking for James Carter," she said when Michelle greeted her. "He's in the greenhouse, and you are?" The woman smiled coldly. "His wife." Michelle felt the world tilt. "That's impossible." "Regina Carter," the woman extended a manicured hand. "Though I was Regina Petrov when we married. Victor's sister." Blood rushed in Michelle's ears. Victor's sister. James had been married to Victor's sister. Regina walked through the store like she owned it, examining everything with distaste. "Quaint little operation you have here. Much different from our estates in Georgia." James emerged from the greenhouse, his face ashen. "Regina, darling." She air-kissed his cheek. "Did you think prison would make me forget about you?" "We've been divorced for 5 years," James said flatly. "On paper perhaps, but family is forever. And now that Victor's empire is gone, we need to rebuild. Together." Michelle watched them, her heart breaking all over again. Everything they'd built felt like it was crumbling. "Get out," James said quietly. Regina laughed. "Don't be absurd. I have proof that you were a willing participant in Victor's operation. From the beginning. One phone call and your deal with the FBI disappears." "Is it true?" Michelle asked. "Were you willing?" James closed his eyes. "Regina and I married young. Her family had money. Mine had debt. Victor offered a way out. But after I saw what they really did..." "He tried to leave," Regina cut in. "So Victor made sure he couldn't." Amazing what gambling debts and a few compromising photos can do. That was 10 years ago, James said. I'm not that person anymore. Regina stepped closer to him. No. The James I knew was ambitious, ruthless when he needed to be. She gestured around the stores. It can't be enough for you. It's everything to me, James said, taking Michelle's hand. These people, this place. I won't let you destroy it. Regina's face hardened. Think carefully, darling. I can take it all away. Your freedom, your precious store. She looked at Michelle. Your new family. Mom. Marcus appeared in the doorway, sensing the tension. Regina smiled like a cat spotting a mouse. Well, isn't he precious? James moved faster than Michelle had ever seen him, putting himself between Regina and Marcus. If you go near them, whatever proof you have won't matter. Because I'll tell the FBI everything about your own involvement, about the money laundering through your art galleries, about the politicians you bribed. Regina's smile faltered. Yeah, James continued. I kept records of everything, insurance, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave, you're going to forget about me, about this place, about them. Because if you don't, we all go down together. The silence stretched, like a rubber band about to snap. Finally, Regina straightened her designer jacket. You've changed. Yes. She walked to the door, then turned back. We could have rebuilt the empire, been greater than Victor ever was. I've got everything I need right here. After she left, Michelle led Marcus to the teaching garden, giving him busy work while she processed what had happened. James found her there later, sitting among the tomato plants. I should have told you about Regina, he said. Yes, she was part of my old life, a life I've spent years trying to forget. Michelle plucked a dead leaf from a plant. Any more secrets I should know about? James sat beside her. No more secrets. No more lies. I'll tell you everything from the beginning. Then you can decide if you still want me here. So he talked and she listened. He told her about growing up poor in Georgia, about meeting Regina at a charity event, about Victor's slow, careful grooming of him into the organization, about his attempts to escape, the threats, the compromise of his soul. But here's the thing, he finished. Everything I was then made me appreciate what I have now. With you, with Marcus, with this place. I finally understand what real success feels like. Michelle was quiet for a long time, her hands deep in the soil. Finally, she spoke. Soil can be poisoned, she said. But with time, with care, it can. Be made clean again. Growing things help. Love helps. She looked at him. I'm still here. James took her dirt-covered hands in his. Together, they watched Marcus teaching younger kids about composting, the afternoon sun turning everything golden. The store bell rang as customers came and went. Life went on. And in the garden, new seeds took root in soil that was finally, truly, clean. Christmas approached Millbrook with twinkling lights and fresh snow. The greenhouse stayed warm and green, filled with poinsettias and winter vegetables. Michelle and James had turned the store's front room into a holiday market, selling wreaths and gift baskets made from their garden's harvest. Marcus, now 13, had his own section where he sold potted herbs he'd grown himself. His green thumb and natural charm made him a favorite with customers. Just like his daddy, an old woman said one day, smiling at James. Neither James nor Marcus corrected her. Over the past months, their bond had grown stronger than any blood tie could be, but the peace of their new life faced another test. A letter arrived from the prison where Victor was serving his life sentence. Michelle found it in the mail, her hands shaking as she read, "Your happy little family won't last. Money talks even in here. Watch your backs." James wanted to go to the FBI, but Michelle stopped him. "We're done running," she said. "This is our home now." They didn't have to wait long to see what Victor meant. The health department suddenly showed up for surprise inspections. Their bank started questioning routine transactions. Anonymous complaints flooded the town council about their business permits. "Victor's still got people on the outside," James said one night after another frustrating day of bureaucratic harassment. "People who owe him favors." Michelle watched Marcus doing homework, at the counter humming Christmas carols. "Then we fight back, the right way this time." They started keeping detailed records of every inspection, every complaint, Sheriff Davis helped them document the pattern of harassment. Their lawyer built a case showing clear evidence of coordinated intimidation. But Victor had one more card to play. A week before Christmas, Regina returned. This time, she wasn't alone. A teenage boy stood beside her with James's eyes and Regina's elegant features. "Meet Thomas," Regina said. "Your son." The revelation hit the store like a bomb. Customers whispered. Marcus ran to his garden, hurt and confusion on his face. "He's 15, Regina continued, enjoying the chaos she'd created. Old enough to know his father. Old enough to inherit." "Inherit what?" James demanded. "Your share of the Petrov fortune. Victor's been declared mentally unfit. Control of the family assets reverts to next of kin. Thomas here has a claim, if you acknowledge him." Michelle watched the boy, seeing the same lost look she'd once seen in James's eyes. Thomas stood stiffly, in his expensive clothes, trying to look bored but clearly uncomfortable. "What do you want?" She asked Regina. "The store. Sign it over to Thomas and we disappear. Refuse and we sue for his inheritance. Every dirty secret comes out in court." James looked at his son, this stranger who shared his blood. "Can I talk to him? Alone?" Regina hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. In the greenhouse, surrounded by Christmas flowers, James faced his past. "Did you know about me?" Thomas asked suddenly. "No." "Your mother? We were separated before." James struggled for words. "She says you abandoned us. I was running from the family business, from what Victor wanted me to become." James touched a poinsettia leaf. "What has she told you about that business?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "That it was import-export. Art deals. And you believe that?" The boy's silence was answer enough. "You've got a choice to make," James said gently. "Just like I did. You can be part of their world, or you can be your own person." "What if I want to be part of your world?" Thomas asked quietly. James looked through the glass walls to where Michelle comforted Marcus. "That's not my choice alone to make." When they returned, Regina was inspecting her manicure. "Well, I'm staying," Thomas announced. Regina's face contorted. "Don't be ridiculous. These people are nothing. We're your family." "Maybe that's the problem." Thomas moved to stand by James. "I want to know my father, the real one, not the stories you told me." "You ungrateful—" "Get out, Regina," James said tiredly. "You've lost. The store stays with us. Thomas stays if he wants to. Try to fight it, and every bit of evidence I have goes public." After Regina stormed out, silence fell in the store. Michelle took James's hand. Marcus emerged from his hiding place. "Does this mean I have a brother?" he asked uncertainly. Thomas looked surprised at the question. James held his breath. Michelle knelt between the boys. "Family's not about blood, remember? It's about love. About choices. There's room in this garden for more than one kind of flower to grow." Marcus considered this, then held out his hand to Thomas. "Want to see my herb garden?" And so their family grew like their garden in unexpected ways. That Christmas, 4 stockings hung behind the store counter. 4 sets of hands tended the winter vegetables. 4 hearts found healing in the warmth of the greenhouse, while outside snow covered Millbrook in a clean white blanket, burying the past under the promise of new beginnings. Spring came early, to Millbrook the following year. The morning sun shone through the greenhouse glass, where Michelle stood arranging flowers for a special event. James and the boys were setting up chairs in the garden outside. A year had passed since Thomas joined their family. The angry, uncertain teenager had grown into a thoughtful young man who found peace in working the soil alongside his father and brother. Marcus had welcomed him completely, teaching him everything about the garden with the enthusiasm only a younger sibling could muster. Today was a celebration, not just of spring, but of endings and beginnings. Victor had died in prison 2 months ago, taking his threats and darkness with him. Regina had signed away all claims to the store in exchange for James's silence about her past. They were finally truly free. "You about ready?" James called from the doorway. He wore a clean white shirt and his best jeans, looking nervous but happy. Michelle smoothed her simple white dress. just finishing the bouquet. Outside, the garden bloomed with new life. Their friends and neighbors filled the chairs, Mrs. Patterson dabbing her eyes already, Sheriff Davis in his Sunday best, patients from the hospital where Michelle still worked part-time. Even some of James's old farming contacts had come, men who'd chosen honest work over Victor's promises. Marcus and Thomas stood together at the front, both in matching shirts, grinning as Michelle walked down the aisle of flowers. James waited for her under an arch of climbing roses, the same roses she'd helped him plant when she first started working at the store, back when everything was simpler and more complicated all at once. "Friends and family," the minister began, "we're gathered here today not just to witness a marriage, but to celebrate a journey of redemption, of forgiveness, of love that grows even in the hardest soil." Michelle looked at James, seeing not the man who had deceived her or the man who had saved her, but the man who had chosen love over power, truth over safety, family over fortune. A man who had learned, as she had, that the heart like a garden could bloom again after winter. "Do you, James Carter, take Michelle Johnson to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was strong and clear. "And do you, Michelle Johnson, take James Carter to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Michelle smiled through her tears. "I do." The boys stepped forward with the rings, simple gold bands they'd helped pick out. As James slipped the ring on her finger, Michelle remembered another ring years ago when he'd been a different man and she'd been a different woman. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The garden erupted in cheers and applause. Marcus hugged them both while Thomas hung back, smiling shyly, until Michelle pulled him into the embrace. The reception was held in the greenhouse, where tables groaned with food made by their neighbors. Mrs. Patterson's famous pies sat next to dishes from the hospital staff and produce from local farmers. Children ran between the plants while adults danced to music, played by a local band. Later, as the sun set, Michelle found James standing in their teaching garden, where it all began. "Having second thoughts?" she teased. He pulled her close. "Only about waiting so long to do this. We needed the time," she said. "The garden taught us that some things can't be rushed." From inside came the sound of Marcus and Thomas arguing good-naturedly about who would give the first toast. Their boys, one born of her body, one born of James's, both born of love and choice and the healing power of growing things. "You." "No," James said. "When I first came to Millbrook, I thought I was just finding another place to hide. Instead, I found my way home." Michelle touched the simple gold ring on her finger. "We all did." They walked back to the greenhouse hand in hand. The lights strung between the plants twinkled like stars, and the air was sweet with the scent of flowers. Their family and friends waited inside, ready to celebrate not just a wedding, but a story of redemption that had grown from the soil of second chances. Behind them, the garden stretched into the gathering dusk. Tomorrow they would work it together, as they had so many days before, as they would for years to come. And in its rich earth, in its steady cycles of planting and growth and harvest, they would always find the truth that had saved them. That love, like a garden, required patience and faith and hard work. That trust, once broken, could be rebuilt leaf by leaf, root by root. That family was what you grew together, not what you were born into, and that even the darkest soil could, with enough care and time and tenderness, bring forth the most beautiful blooms. The store's bell rang one last time as they stepped inside to join their celebration. Outside, the first stars appeared above Millbrook, shining down on a place where secrets had been transformed into truth, where lies had given way to love, and where a simple garden had grown into something more precious than any empire. A home.